A warm evening settled over Raleigh's city park, where families, friends, and neighbors gathered to unwind. The faint rustling of leaves was soon drowned out by a heavy, jarring voice. "What are you hiding?" The policeman's voice cut through the evening air, cold and skeptical, his hand hovering menacingly near his belt. The woman looked up, surprised and shaken, her hand instinctively covering her stomach, a soft, silent gesture that hinted at the life growing inside her. She stammered, "I'm just sitting here, just resting. There's nothing hidden." But the policeman didn't seem to hear her words. Or maybe he simply didn't care. "I don't believe you," he sneered, stepping closer. "You people always have something up your sleeves." The crowd that had once filled the park with laughter and chatter turned silent, eyes fixed on the confrontation with a mix of discomfort and unease. People whispered, glancing at each other, but no one dared to step forward. The woman took a deep breath, her voice steady but colored with a trembling that only those who had faced fear could understand. "Officer, please. I'm not doing anything wrong." But he scoffed, crossing his arms with a smirk. "Of course, you'd say that." He tilted his head, his eyes scanning her up and down with a look so cold it made her shiver. "This park isn't for you people to loiter around and make trouble." It was a slap in the face, a punch of words that went straight to her core, but she held her ground, clutching her belly protectively. The murmurs around grew louder, some onlookers even shifted uncomfortably, but fear kept them planted where they stood. "Did you hear me?" The policeman's voice sharpened, a dangerous edge of anger making his face harden. He took another step toward her, nearly nose to nose, his face twisted with disgust. "What are you hiding?" he repeated, louder this time, his fingers inching closer to his weapon. Her eyes darted to his hand, her voice barely a whisper. "Please. I just need a moment." "Your moment is up," he spat, and with a motion as sudden as it was vicious, he shoved her backward. She stumbled but caught herself, her face a mixture of shock and a familiar pain, one that told her that this wasn't a first, and might not be a last. But what came next was beyond anything she could have anticipated. The officer's hand shot forward, delivering a brutal, cold punch that made her gasp, doubling over with a sharp pain. The silence that followed was thick with shock. The crowd gasped collectively, whispers escalating into stunned outrage. A few onlookers covered their mouths in disbelief. It was more than a punch, it was an open declaration of disregard, an attack not only on her but on something deeper, her dignity, her worth. But then, just as swiftly as the assault had landed, there was a sound, a commanding, firm voice cutting through the tension with a strength and authority that made even the policeman freeze in his stance. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice wasn't loud, but it was unyielding, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. Heads turned, people's eyes widening in recognition, and a sense of something seismic rippled through the air. The officer's smirk faltered, but his stance held. "Just dealing with a little trouble here." "Trouble?" The figure moved forward, and there was a weight in his gaze that seemed to crush the air around them. "The only trouble I see is a cowardly act from a man who abuses his authority." The officer's face paled slightly, but he forced a laugh, a brittle sound that betrayed his unease. She was loitering. Acting suspicious. The tension around them crackled, thicker with every second that passed. The newcomer stepped closer, his eyes not leaving the officer for a second, his expression a controlled fury that was simmering just below the surface. "So, that's why you thought it was justified to hit a pregnant woman?" Silence. The crowd held their breath, every eye glued to the unfolding drama, caught between the horror of what they had witnessed and the sense that something unstoppable was coming. The policeman's voice wavered, his bravado slipping. "Look, I didn't realize," but his words were cut off, swallowed by the intense gaze of the man standing before him, a man who, as if by sheer force of will, seemed to command justice into the space around them. There was a shift in the air, a palpable understanding that whoever stood here now wasn't just another witness, he was the kind of person who could make things right, someone who wouldn't let this injustice slide. As their eyes locked in a silent battle, a single question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by everyone watching. What would happen now? And as the man's jaw tightened, an almost imperceptible smile, a smile that held something unexpected, something dangerous, tugged at the corner of his mouth. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, injustice, and discrimination. We believe in sharing stories that not only entertain but also shed light on real struggles and triumphs. To our Black audience, know that we see you, we support you, and we honor your resilience. Stand proud, because your strength is invaluable, and your story matters. Enjoy this powerful journey, and if you find meaning here, please subscribe for more stories that stand for truth and justice. The early evening light cast a soft glow over the sprawling city park in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was a place where families came to relax, where couples strolled under the trees, and where, on any given evening, you might catch the echoes of laughter from children racing across the grass. This wasn't just a park, it was a gathering place, a pocket of community in a city alive with diversity in stories. Tonight, it was where a confrontation would unfold that no one could have predicted, and where people would witness a side of their city that was both disturbing and uncomfortably familiar. Sitting on a bench near the park's small lake was Jamal Carter, a man whose presence commanded respect yet held a quiet warmth. Jamal wasn't just any figure in Raleigh, he was the sheriff, a role he had taken on with an intense sense of purpose. Known for his unwavering integrity and a rare blend of strength and compassion, Jamal had built a reputation that resonated far beyond his department. He was not only respected, he was trusted, even admired. A black man in a position of authority, he knew the delicate balance he walked in the community and how, often, his actions meant more than his words. Beside Jamal was his wife, Amara, a woman whose strength matched her husband's, though it often showed in different ways. Amara had an inner resolve that carried her through life with a quiet fierceness. She was intelligent, perceptive, and as deeply committed to justice as Jamal was. In fact, it was her influence that had often encouraged Jamal to push for reform within the department, to strive for real change instead of settling for surface-level fixes. Amara, currently pregnant with their first child, carried herself with a grace that seemed untouched by the weight of the world around her. But beneath her calm exterior was a woman who was all too aware of the challenges she and her family faced. She knew that bringing a black child into this world was as much an act of defiance as it was of love. As they talked quietly, sharing a rare, peaceful moment together, their hands occasionally brushed, a silent exchange of reassurance. They didn't know it, but this tranquility would soon be shattered. Elsewhere in the park, a third figure walked with a different air. Officer Bradley Hensley was known within his circles as a man who held his position with pride, a certain kind of pride that too easily slipped into arrogance. Bradley had been with the Raleigh police force for years, and though his record was spotless on paper, he was well known for his hardline views and his unconventional methods when dealing with certain communities. To him, his badge was a mark of authority, not necessarily of duty or responsibility. He walked the city with an almost territorial instinct, seeing those who didn't look or act like him as outsiders. His encounters with Raleigh's black and Latino residents were tinged with an unspoken but deeply felt disdain, or resentment he rarely bothered to hide. And tonight, he noticed Amara sitting alone on the bench. For Bradley, the sight of a black woman sitting quietly, confidently, in a public space was somehow offensive, challenging his unspoken beliefs about who belonged where. His gaze narrowed, and something in him hardened. He approached her with an expression that masked hostility as duty. "Ma'am," Bradley called, his voice tight. Amara looked up, her calm expression only aggravating Bradley further. "What are you doing here this late?" Amara, taken aback by the suddenness of his question, met his eyes with a steady gaze. "I'm just resting, officer." "Is there something wrong with that?" Bradley's face tightened. "We've had complaints about certain activities in the area," he lied smoothly, glancing around as if searching for support. "You wouldn't happen to have anything in that bag you're hiding, would you?" Amara's hand instinctively went to her belly, her other hand resting protectively over her purse. She knew this type of encounter too well. She'd heard Jamal's stories, seen the cautionary tales play out in the news, and she was all too familiar with the dangers of escalating a situation like this. "No, officer," she replied quietly. "I'm just here waiting for my husband." Bradley snorted, a thin, disdainful smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Oh, sure, waiting for your husband," he repeated, as though mocking her. "How convenient. And tell me, why are you sitting here, of all places? Got nowhere else to go?" Amara's face flushed, but she remained steady, refusing to give him the reaction he so clearly wanted. "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I'm simply sitting here in a public space." The look on Bradley's face grew darker. He took another step forward, standing close enough that Amara could feel the sharpness of his gaze bearing down on her. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, voice dripping with authority. "Now." At this, Amara's calm finally began to crack. "Is this really necessary? I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm not doing anything. It's necessary when I say it's necessary," Bradley interrupted, his tone cutting off any sense of conversation. "You people think you can just do whatever you want, don't you?" Those words cut deep, carrying the weight of an all-too-familiar prejudice. Amara's face turned pale, her heart pounding. She knew she was in a vulnerable position, her pregnancy making her cautious, and yet, there was a fierce dignity in her gaze that even Bradley couldn't ignore. "What are you hiding?" he pressed, reaching out as if to take her purse by force. It was at that moment that Jamal appeared. He had just rounded the corner, his stride confident but calm, when he spotted his wife and Bradley in the middle of what he instantly recognized as a confrontation. In an instant, his expression shifted from one of surprise to one of barely controlled anger. Jamal could read the situation without a word needing to be spoken. Bradley turned, catching sight of Jamal and visibly stiffening. There was something in Jamal's posture, in the set of his jaw, that Bradley hadn't anticipated. But Bradley's arrogance held him steady. After all, he had the upper hand here, or so he thought. "Is there a problem, Officer Hensley?" Jamal's voice was steady, calm, but beneath it was a simmering rage that was unmistakable. "Just a routine check," Bradley replied, his tone feigning innocence. "Your wife seemed suspicious, just sitting out here alone. I have to make sure everything's above board." Jamal's eyes flickered to Amara, a silent understanding passing between them. "Suspicious," he repeated, his voice now low, carrying an edge that suggested there was more he wanted to say, much more, but he was holding back, for now. "Yes," Bradley replied, his voice laced with a thinly veiled contempt. "Suspicious." The moment hung heavy, charged with an unspoken conflict. Jamal knew exactly what Bradley was implying, knew the layers of prejudice that fueled his words. But this wasn't the place, not yet. He wouldn't let this escalate here, not in front of Amara, not where he couldn't protect her fully. Jamal took a slow breath, his gaze steady on Bradley. "We can discuss this," he said, voice measured. "But I suggest we do it at the station, where these suspicions can be laid out properly." Bradley hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. He knew he was on thin ice, knew that one wrong step could put him in a position he couldn't talk his way out of. But he also knew that he was still the one holding the immediate power. "Fine," Bradley said finally, a hint of smugness returning. "We'll handle it, properly." But as he turned away, there was a gleam in his eye, a look that promised this wasn't over. Amara gripped Jamal's hand, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a promise that they wouldn't let this go. In the days following that charged encounter at the park, Jamal could hardly shake the lingering tension. Bradley's arrogance, his complete disregard for Amara's dignity, and that cold, remorseless stare were burned into Jamal's mind. Jamal had dealt with tough officers before, even some with borderline racist tendencies. But Bradley was different, he didn't hide his contempt. And now, more than ever, Jamal felt an urgent responsibility to protect his community from men like him. Back at the precinct, the mood was tense. Jamal could feel eyes on him as he moved through the hallways, a silent, skeptical gaze from some officers who viewed his position as a sheriff, a black sheriff, as an anomaly. A rare few respected him genuinely, but others looked at him as if he didn't belong, as if his presence was somehow an affront. Bradley, though, seemed to embody all of that disdain in one single, concentrated figure. One morning, a few days after the incident, Jamal walked into his office to find Bradley waiting just outside the door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Jamal felt a flare of irritation but steadied his gaze as he approached. "Sheriff," Bradley greeted, his voice barely masking a taunt. "Can we talk?" Jamal nodded, opening his office door and gesturing for Bradley to follow him in. The door closed, and Jamal took a seat behind his desk, leveling a calm, steady look at the officer standing across from him. Bradley wasted no time. "Look, about the park," he began, his voice carrying a touch of forced restraint. "I was doing my job. A suspicious person is a suspicious person, no matter who she's married to." Jamal's face remained impassive. "A suspicious person," he echoed, his voice low but firm. "Bradley, you knew who she was." "That wasn't about suspicion, it was about disrespect." Bradley's lips twisted into a smirk. "Disrespect," he mocked, shrugging. "Come on, Sheriff. You can't expect everyone to know everyone around here. I saw someone loitering, and I handled it. You may see it differently, but this was by the book." Jamal leaned forward, his gaze sharpening. "If your book includes harassing a pregnant woman sitting quietly in a public space, then maybe it's time for a new book." The silence that followed was thick, charged with the unspoken tension between them. Bradley's smirk faltered, his expression hardening. "You think you can just come in here and change the way things are done, Sheriff?" Bradley's voice dripped with contempt. "Maybe you're in charge now, but some of us, we know how things actually work around here." Jamal's jaw clenched. He could feel his patience fraying, but he held on to his composure. "I am in charge, Bradley," he replied evenly. "And you would do well to remember that." Bradley met his gaze for a long moment, the two men locked in a silent, tense standoff. Finally, Bradley straightened, giving a slow nod. "Fine," he said, turning toward the door. "I guess we'll just see how long you last." As he left, Jamal felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He knew men like Bradley didn't change overnight. But he also knew that if he backed down now, it would send a message to everyone else, that it was okay to treat people like they didn't belong. And he wasn't going to let that happen. Not in his precinct. Not in his city. Over the next few days, Jamal began quietly gathering information. Bradley's record might have been clean, but Jamal knew that didn't mean he hadn't left a trail. He spoke to a few officers who he trusted, hinting that he was looking into a pattern of behavior. It was subtle work, and Jamal knew he couldn't outright accuse Bradley without concrete evidence. But he needed something, anything that would show just how deep Bradley's actions ran. Meanwhile, Amara watched her husband's growing frustration with a worried heart. She understood his position, the challenges he faced, but she feared for his safety, too. Jamal was a proud man, one who refused to be intimidated, but she knew that his position made him a target in ways that others couldn't understand. One evening, as Jamal sat at the dining room table, poring over notes and records, Amara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jamal," she said softly, her voice steady yet tinged with worry. "Is it worth it? Bradley, he's not just any officer. If he feels threatened," Jamal looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of determination and exhaustion. "Amara, I can't let this go," he replied quietly. "If I let Bradley treat you like that, if I let him get away with it, what message does that send to everyone else?" Amara held his gaze, her heart heavy with both pride and fear. "Just, promise me you'll be careful." Jamal nodded, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "I will," he promised. "But I need you to trust me. I need you to know that this isn't just about Bradley. It's about making sure people like him don't get to make the rules." The days passed, and Jamal's search for answers slowly started to yield results. A few whispered rumors here, a couple of anonymous tips there. The pieces were small, but they painted a picture, a history of complaints from residents, allegations of excessive force, accusations that had somehow been swept under the rug. Jamal could feel the weight of these revelations, a slow burn of anger that fueled his resolve. Then, one afternoon, a breakthrough came. An older officer named Thompson, a quiet man who kept mostly to himself, approached Jamal in the hallway. He glanced around, making sure they were alone, before speaking in a low voice. "I heard you're looking into Bradley," he murmured. "There's something you should know." Jamal's attention sharpened. "Go on." Thompson hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "Bradley, he has friends in high places. People who have protected him before. But I've been here long enough to see the things that get swept under the rug." Jamal's heart pounded. "Like what?" Thompson looked down, a shadow crossing his face. "A few years ago, there was an incident. A young black man. Bradley claimed he resisted arrest, but, let's just say the story didn't add up. And somehow, it all went away. Like it never happened." Jamal's stomach twisted. He could feel the anger simmering beneath his skin, a righteous fury that made his hands clench. "Thank you, Thompson," he said, his voice tight. "This is exactly what I needed." Thompson nodded, casting one last glance down the hallway. "Be careful, Sheriff. Bradley isn't one to back down easily." That night, Jamal sat alone in his office, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about protecting Amara, it was about ensuring that people like Bradley were held accountable, that their actions had consequences. Jamal felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, but with it came a sense of purpose. He was ready to confront Bradley, to put an end to the unchecked abuse that had haunted his community for too long. But as he prepared for the confrontation, a gnawing doubt tugged at the back of his mind. Bradley wasn't the type to take this quietly. Jamal knew there would be backlash, that Bradley would fight tooth and nail to protect his reputation and his position. And as he thought about the possible fallout, a single question echoed in his mind, a question that would haunt him as he moved toward the inevitable showdown: how far would Bradley go to keep his power intact? The air in the precinct was thick with tension as Jamal approached the briefing room, the echo of his footsteps reverberating against the silence of the corridor. It was late, and most officers had gone home, but a few stragglers lingered, talking in hushed voices, their expressions guarded as they saw Jamal pass by. They knew he'd been investigating Bradley, that he was getting closer to exposing the officer's history of abuse and misconduct. Word spread fast in the precinct, and tonight, the air felt charged with something he couldn't quite name. He could feel eyes on him, quiet, watchful. Jamal was a man used to scrutiny, but tonight felt different. He had barely entered his office when he heard a knock, sharp and insistent. "Come in," Jamal called, expecting one of his deputies. The door opened, and there stood Bradley, his expression unreadable, eyes cold and fixed on Jamal with a hard intensity. Jamal's gut tightened, and he straightened, bracing himself. There was something different about Bradley tonight, his usual smug arrogance had been replaced by a steely, simmering anger. "Bradley," Jamal said, his voice calm but laced with caution. "Is there something I can help you with?" Bradley shut the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't answer immediately, instead taking a few steps closer, his eyes never leaving Jamal's face. "You've been busy," Bradley finally said, his tone icy, almost mocking. "Asking around, digging into things you shouldn't be. Thought we were clear about boundaries, Sheriff." Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "Boundaries?" he repeated, a hint of disbelief in his voice. This isn't about boundaries, Bradley. This is about accountability. There are people, good people, who deserve better than what you've done to them. Bradley let out a low, humorless chuckle, folding his arms over his chest as he leaned against Jamal's desk. Accountability, huh? That's a nice word. Fancy. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? He leaned in closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. Let me tell you something, Jamal. You're not invincible. And just because you have that badge on doesn't mean you get to change how things work around here. Jamal clenched his jaw, keeping his voice steady. This isn't about changing things, Bradley. It's about doing what's right. You've crossed the line too many times, and it's time you answer for it. Bradley's smirk faded, replaced by a hard, calculating expression. He straightened, stepping back, but his gaze remained locked on Jamal, unyielding. You're really willing to risk everything for this, aren't you? For some ideal that doesn't even exist. Jamal felt a surge of anger, but he kept his voice level, controlled. This isn't about ideals, Bradley. It's about justice. Real justice. Something you wouldn't understand. A flicker of something dark crossed Bradley's face, and for a moment, Jamal saw a flash of the man beneath the uniform, the anger, the bitterness, the resentment that had driven him all these years. It was a glimpse into something toxic, something that had festered unchecked for too long. Bradley's voice was low, dangerous. You think you're better than me? You think you're above all of this? He took a step closer, his tone sharp, cutting. Let me tell you something, Sheriff. You're just like the rest of us. You're a pawn in a game that's been going on long before you ever got that badge. Jamal met his gaze, unflinching. Maybe I am. But at least I'm not using my position to hurt innocent people. Bradley's lips twisted into a sneer, his voice dripping with contempt. Innocent? You don't know a thing about innocent. He leaned in closer, his eyes cold and unfeeling. These people you think you're protecting? They're not worth the trouble. They don't deserve the protection you're trying to give them. Jamal's face hardened, his voice low and deadly. You don't get to decide who deserves protection, Bradley. That's not your job. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. Bradley straightened, his expression shifting into one of calculated indifference. Fine, he said, his voice casual, dismissive. Do what you want. But don't say I didn't warn you. He turned on his heel, striding toward the door. But before he left, he cast one last look over his shoulder, his gaze cold and unfeeling. You're playing a dangerous game, Sheriff. Be careful it doesn't turn on you. With that, he was gone, leaving Jamal alone in his office, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He knew that Bradley wasn't just posturing, there was a real threat behind his words, a dark promise that made Jamal's skin prickle with unease. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when he was so close to the truth. The next day, Jamal filed his report, detailing the allegations against Bradley, the testimonies he had gathered, the evidence he had uncovered. It was a damning report, one that painted a clear picture of abuse, of misconduct, of a man who had used his position to wield power over those who were powerless to defend themselves. Jamal knew that this report would shake the precinct, that it would force people to confront the uncomfortable truth of what had been happening under their noses for years. But as he submitted the report, he felt a sense of calm, a sense of purpose. This was what he had become a sheriff to do. This was why he had fought so hard to make it to this position, to be a voice for those who couldn't speak, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be backlash, that people would try to discredit him, to undermine his authority. But he was ready. He was prepared to face whatever came next. Later that evening, Jamal returned home, exhausted but resolved. As he walked through the door, Amara met him with a quiet, knowing smile, her hand resting gently on her belly. How'd it go? She asked softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pride and concern. Jamal took a deep breath, his expression softening as he looked at her. "It's done," he said simply. "I filed the report. Now we wait." Amara nodded, her gaze steady. "And if they don't listen?" Jamal's jaw tightened, a steely resolve in his eyes. "Then we'll make them listen. One way or another." The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and uncertainty. The precinct was abuzz with rumors, whispers of Jamal's report, of the allegations against Bradley. Some officers looked at Jamal with newfound respect, while others cast him wary, suspicious glances, as if he were a threat to their carefully maintained status quo. But Jamal stood firm, refusing to let the weight of their judgment sway him. He knew that what he had done was right, that he had upheld his duty to protect and serve, even if it meant going against one of his own. Then, one morning, as Jamal entered the precinct, he was met by a group of officers, their expressions grim and solemn. Bradley stood among them, his face twisted into a mask of barely concealed rage. "Sheriff," one of the officers said, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm, to meet their gazes with unwavering resolve. "What is this about?" he asked, his voice steady. The officer hesitated, glancing at Bradley before turning back to Jamal. "There have been accusations against you of misconduct." Jamal's heart pounded, a surge of anger and disbelief flooding through him. "Accusations?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "What kind of accusations?" Bradley stepped forward, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "There are claims that you've been abusing your power, Sheriff. That you've been targeting officers, trying to undermine the department. Some people think you're a liability." Jamal felt a surge of fury, his hands clenching at his sides. He knew what this was, retaliation, a desperate attempt to discredit him, to silence him. But he wouldn't let them get away with it. "This is a lie," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "And you know it. This is nothing but a pathetic attempt to protect a man who has hurt innocent people." The silence that followed was thick with tension, the other officers shifting uncomfortably, their gazes flickering between Jamal and Bradley. Bradley's smirk returned, a cruel, mocking smile that made Jamal's skin crawl. "Maybe. But it's your word against mine, Sheriff. And I have friends in high places. People who believe in me. People who won't let some idealistic crusade ruin their department." Jamal's gaze didn't waver, his voice calm but filled with steely resolve. "This isn't over, Bradley. Not by a long shot." Bradley chuckled, his eyes glinting with malice. "We'll see about that." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jamal standing alone, a sense of dread settling over him. But even as he stood there, alone and outnumbered, Jamal felt a fierce determination burning within him. He wouldn't let them silence him. He wouldn't let them protect a man who had caused so much pain. Jamal stood rooted in the precinct hallway, the words from his confrontation with Bradley lingering in the air. The tension was palpable, the other officers glancing his way, some with discomfort, others with outright hostility. Jamal could feel their eyes on him as he made his way down the hall, back to his office, his mind racing with the implications of Bradley's threat. He knew Bradley would come after him, but this, a manufactured accusation of misconduct, was beyond what he had expected. It was calculated, cruel, and entirely within Bradley's style. As Jamal closed the door to his office, he exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. He knew he needed a plan, something solid to counteract Bradley's claims before they gained traction. But where would he even start? Bradley's web of influence ran deeper than he'd realized. And while Jamal was determined to stand his ground, he couldn't ignore the quiet fear gnawing at him. This was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Jamal looked up to see Officer Thompson stepping into the office, his expression conflicted. Thompson hesitated before closing the door behind him and taking a seat across from Jamal. He glanced down, rubbing his hands together, as if weighing his words carefully. "Sheriff," he started quietly, "I need to be honest with you about something." Jamal nodded, his expression encouraging. "Go ahead, Thompson." Thompson's gaze shifted uneasily. "Bradley's accusation, it's going to stick if we don't do something about it. I've seen this kind of thing play out before. He's got friends higher up, people who'll back him up no matter what. People who'd rather have things stay the way they've always been, if you get my meaning." Jamal clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "So you're saying they'll take his word over mine? Without any proof?" Thompson nodded reluctantly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Bradley's got the connections, and he knows how to play them. If you don't get some solid evidence on your side, he'll make sure this whole thing buries you before you even have a chance to fight it." Jamal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had been gathering information, small pieces of the puzzle, but it wasn't enough. He needed something undeniable, something that would force even Bradley's allies to take notice. "Do you know of anything specific, Thompson?" Jamal asked, his voice steady but urgent. "Something we can use?" Thompson looked down, as if debating with himself, before meeting Jamal's gaze. "There was an incident a while back, an arrest Bradley made. A young guy, no priors, clean record. Bradley claimed he resisted, but, a lot of us knew it didn't add up. He had bruises, broken ribs, a concussion. There was talk of him filing a report, but somehow, it disappeared. Just like that. Swept under the rug." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "Do you know who this man is? Is he still around?" Thompson nodded. "I don't know if he'd be willing to talk, but I can get you his information. He works downtown. Name's Darius. I can put in a call, see if he'd be willing to meet with you." Jamal's resolve hardened. "Do it," he said firmly. "If Darius is willing to talk, we might have a chance to expose Bradley for who he really is." Thompson nodded, standing to leave. "Be careful, Sheriff. Bradley's not going to go down without a fight." "I'm ready for whatever he throws at me," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "Thank you, Thompson. For standing by me." Thompson gave a small nod before slipping out of the office, leaving Jamal alone once again. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of his responsibility felt heavier than ever. But Jamal knew he had no choice. This was a fight he had to see through, for Amara, for Darius, and for everyone else who had been hurt by Bradley's unchecked power. Later that evening, Jamal drove downtown, his mind focused as he pulled up outside a small cafe where Thompson had arranged the meeting. Inside, he spotted a young man sitting in a corner booth, his posture tense, his gaze wary as he watched Jamal approach. "Darius?" Jamal greeted, extending a hand as he sat down across from him. Darius nodded, his eyes flickering with a mixture of caution and curiosity. He looked like he was barely out of his 20s, but there was a weariness in his expression, a weight that spoke of experiences no one should have to endure. "You're Sheriff Carter?" Darius asked, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. Jamal nodded. "I am. I understand if you're hesitant, but I wanted to speak to you about Bradley Hensley. Thompson mentioned you had an encounter with him a while back." Darius's expression hardened, and he let out a bitter chuckle. "Encounter. That's one way to put it." Jamal leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I want to bring him to justice, Darius. But I can't do it alone. I need people who've seen his true colors to come forward." Darius's eyes flickered with anger and something darker, fear. "You don't know what you're asking," he said quietly. "Bradley, he's got people watching his back. Powerful people. I tried to report him once, but nothing happened. The complaint just disappeared. Like it never even existed. Jamal's fists clenched under the table. That's exactly why we need you, Darius. If enough people speak up, they won't be able to ignore it. We can build a case against him, something solid, something they can't bury. Darius hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window as he considered Jamal's words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and the weight of the decision Darius had to make. Finally, he turned back to Jamal, his expression resolute. I'll do it. I'll tell you what happened. But, you have to promise me something, Sheriff. Anything, Jamal replied, his voice firm. Promise me that you won't let him walk away from this. That he'll finally answer for what he's done. Jamal nodded, his gaze steady. I give you my word, Darius. We're going to see this through. Over the next few days, Jamal and Darius met several times, gathering evidence, recording statements, building a case that could stand up against Bradley's influence. Each piece of information they uncovered added to the growing picture of corruption and abuse that Bradley had hidden behind his badge. Jamal felt a renewed sense of purpose, a fire that pushed him forward even as the threat of Bradley's retaliation loomed over him. Then, one afternoon, as Jamal was leaving the precinct, he found Bradley waiting for him in the parking lot. Bradley leaned against his car, arms crossed, his gaze cold and calculating as he watched Jamal approach. Sheriff, Bradley greeted, his voice dripping with mockery. Heard you've been busy. Jamal kept his expression neutral, refusing to let Bradley's presence rattle him. I don't have time for games, Bradley. If you've got something to say, say it. Bradley's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with malice. You think you're so noble, don't you? Think you're some kind of hero. But here's the thing, Jamal, you're not. You're just a guy with a badge, same as me. And if you keep poking around, you're going to find out what happens to people who step out of line. Jamal met Bradley's gaze, his voice cold and unyielding. I'm not afraid of you, Bradley. And I'm not afraid of whatever you think you can do to me. People like you, your power is built on fear, on intimidation. But that power doesn't last. Eventually, the truth comes out. Bradley's expression twisted, his smirk fading into a look of pure, unfiltered rage. You think you're so righteous, don't you? So much better than the rest of us. Well, I've got news for you, Sheriff. You're nothing. Just another do-gooder in over his head. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. Maybe I am. But at least I'm not hurting innocent people to protect myself. You're a disgrace to the badge, Bradley. And sooner or later, everyone is going to see that. Bradley took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you can scare me with your little speeches? You're playing with fire, Jamal. And when this all comes crashing down, I'll be there to watch you burn. Jamal didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. We'll see about that. Bradley held his gaze for a long moment before turning away, his footsteps echoing through the parking lot as he disappeared into the shadows. Jamal watched him go, a mixture of anger and determination burning in his chest. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that Bradley would stop at nothing to protect himself. But Jamal was prepared to face whatever came his way. As he stood alone in the dim light of the parking lot, he felt a surge of resolve. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had been hurt, everyone who had suffered because of men like Bradley. And he would see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. In the days that followed the intense standoff between Jamal and Bradley, the precinct buzzed with a tense silence. Jamal went about his duties, his interactions with fellow officers now tinged with a subtle distance. Some nodded at him with a quiet respect, recognizing his courage, while others kept their distance, either out of loyalty to Bradley or fear of crossing someone as powerful and well-connected as him. Yet Jamal remained resolute, pouring his energy into solidifying his case against Bradley. He worked with Darius to document everything, to gather testimony that could counteract Bradley's influence. But with each passing day, the weight of his position grew heavier, as though every action, every decision, pulled him further into a moral maze with no clear end. Then, a complication arose, one Jamal hadn't anticipated. Darius called him one evening, his voice shaking with barely contained fear. "Sheriff. I think someone's following me," Darius said, his words coming out in quick, nervous bursts. "I've been seeing the same car outside my apartment, at work, they're just there, watching." Jamal's heart sank. He knew Bradley wouldn't let this go easily, but he had hoped that he would keep his tactics confined to the precinct, to subtle threats and power plays. But this, stalking Darius, was a new level of intimidation, a tactic meant to break the young man's resolve and keep him silent. "Darius, listen to me," Jamal said firmly, doing his best to reassure him. "I need you to stay calm. Go somewhere safe, stay with a friend or family member if you can, but don't be alone. I'll make sure someone from my team keeps an eye on things." Darius hesitated, his fear palpable even through the phone. "Sheriff, I don't know if I can do this. Bradley, he's got people on his side. People who can make things disappear. He already did it once. What's stopping him from doing it again?" Jamal took a deep breath, fighting the frustration bubbling beneath his calm facade. "Nothing," he replied honestly, "except us. Darius, this is about more than just you or me. It's about making sure people like him don't get away with abusing their power. But if you're not ready to go through with it, I understand." The silence on the other end was thick, tense. Jamal could feel Darius wrestling with his decision, caught between the desire for justice and the very real fear of retaliation. Finally, Darius spoke, his voice quieter, but more resolute. "I want to do this, Sheriff. I need to know you have my back." "You have my word," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "No matter what happens, I'll be there. We'll see this through together." But as he hung up, Jamal's mind was already racing, calculating his next steps. He knew that Darius's testimony was crucial, and if Bradley was already resorting to intimidation, things were about to get even more complicated. Jamal needed to keep Darius safe, and he needed to find a way to expose Bradley without putting anyone else at risk. The next morning, Jamal went to his captain's office, armed with a detailed report of the situation. He laid out his case, explaining the evidence he had gathered and the pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. He spoke with passion and conviction, his words leaving no room for doubt about the gravity of the situation. But as he finished, the captain leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff, you've done a lot of good work here," he said finally. "But you need to understand that going after someone like Bradley, it's not going to be easy. He's got friends in high places, people who won't be pleased to see him taken down." Jamal's jaw tightened. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated it coming from his own captain. "With all due respect, sir," he replied, "we're talking about an officer who has abused his power repeatedly, who has hurt innocent people, who has brought shame to this department. Are we really going to look the other way because it's difficult?" The captain sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm not saying we'll look the other way, Jamal. But you need to be smart about this. Bradley, he's got enough connections to make life very difficult for anyone who goes up against him. If you're going to take him down, you need to be prepared for the consequences." Jamal held his gaze, his resolve unshaken. "I am prepared. And I'm not doing this alone. There are people willing to come forward, people who want to see justice done." The captain looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening slightly. "All right, Sheriff. You have my support. But be careful. Bradley isn't the kind of man who goes down without a fight." With his captain's tentative backing, Jamal pressed forward, gathering statements from other officers who had witnessed Bradley's behavior, securing video evidence where he could, and ensuring that Darius was protected at all times. It was a delicate balance, a high-stakes game where every move mattered, and Jamal knew that one wrong step could unravel everything he had worked for. Then, late one night, Jamal received a call from Amara. Her voice was tense, filled with an urgency that made his heart race. "Jamal, there's a car outside our house," she whispered, her tone barely more than a breath. "It's been there for hours. I didn't think much of it at first, but something doesn't feel right." Jamal's blood ran cold. Bradley's reach was wider than he'd realized, and now, it seemed, his own family was in the line of fire. "Stay inside, lock the doors, and don't open them for anyone," he instructed her, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'm coming home. Don't worry, Amara. I'll handle this." As he sped home, his mind raced, a mixture of anger and fear pulsing through him. Bradley had crossed a line, threatening his wife was beyond anything Jamal could tolerate. This wasn't just about power or control anymore. It was personal. When he pulled up outside his house, he saw the car Amara had mentioned parked across the street, its headlights off but the faint glow of a cigarette visible through the driver's side window. Jamal's fists clenched as he approached, every step measured, his mind focused. He rapped on the driver's window, his expression hard. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" he asked, his voice low but laced with authority. The window rolled down slowly, and Bradley's smirking face came into view. "Just making sure everything's all right, Sheriff. No harm in checking up on my colleagues, right?" Jamal's anger flared, but he kept his voice controlled. "This ends now, Bradley. You've crossed a line, and you're going to pay for it." Bradley chuckled, his smirk widening. "Pay? For what? I'm not doing anything illegal, Jamal. Just looking out for my fellow officers, making sure everyone's safe. You should be thanking me." Jamal took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. There's a line between us, Bradley, and you crossed it the moment you came here." Bradley's face hardened, the smirk vanishing. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about some moral high ground, Jamal. This is survival. And if you think you can win, you're more naive than I thought." Jamal didn't flinch, his resolve only strengthening. "The difference between us, Bradley, is that I have people who believe in me because they trust me, because they know I stand for something. You're just a man hiding behind a badge, using fear to keep yourself safe. That's not power. That's weakness." Bradley's eyes narrowed, a flicker of rage flashing across his face. For a moment, the two men stood there in silence, the tension between them thick, charged with the weight of their unspoken hatred. "You think you're some kind of hero," Bradley spat finally, his voice filled with contempt. "But heroes don't last, Jamal. Heroes get broken. And you're no different." Jamal held his gaze, his voice steady and unyielding. "Maybe I'm not a hero. But at least I can look at myself in the mirror and know I'm doing the right thing. Can you say the same?" Bradley sneered, his face twisted with a mixture of anger and bitterness. "You'll regret this, Jamal. Mark my words." Jamal's gaze didn't waver. "The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Bradley fuming in his car, his threats echoing in the night air. Jamal felt a fierce sense of resolve, a renewed determination to see this through, no matter the cost. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, that Bradley would continue to fight, to scheme, to protect his twisted sense of power. But Jamal was ready for whatever came next. Back inside, Amara met him with a look of concern, her hand resting on her belly. "Is it over?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Jamal wrapped his arms around her, his voice steady. "Not yet," he admitted. "But it will be soon. I'm going to make sure of it." She nodded, her gaze filled with unwavering support. "I believe in you, Jamal. We all do." In that moment, Jamal felt a surge of gratitude, a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that no matter what happened, he wasn't alone in this fight. And as he held Amara close, he silently vowed to see this through to the end, to stand against Bradley's corruption and abuse of power, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been hurt, everyone who had been silenced. The final showdown was coming, and Jamal was ready to face it head-on. The day of reckoning came sooner than expected. After weeks of gathering evidence, filing reports, and rallying support, Jamal finally received word from the precinct's Internal Affairs Committee. They had agreed to review his case against Bradley, and Jamal was summoned to present his findings in a closed hearing. It was the moment he'd been fighting for, a chance to expose the truth and ensure that justice was served. Inside the meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. High-ranking officers and members of the Internal Affairs Committee sat behind a long table, their expressions unreadable as they prepared to hear both sides. Bradley was there, too, seated across from Jamal, his face a mask of feigned innocence. But Jamal could see the anger simmering beneath his calm facade. This was a man who was not used to being challenged, and the fact that his actions were now under scrutiny was a humiliation he could barely tolerate. As Jamal began to present his evidence, he remained calm and methodical, laying out each instance of abuse, each manipulation of power, each person Bradley had intimidated. He presented testimonies, including Darius's powerful account of his own encounter with Bradley, and video evidence that painted an undeniable picture of corruption. Jamal spoke with conviction, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. This was his chance to speak for all those who had been silenced, and he wasn't going to waste it. When Jamal finished, the room was quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The committee exchanged glances, their expressions solemn. Bradley's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of barely contained fury. For the first time, he seemed genuinely unsettled. But then, Bradley spoke, his voice steady but laced with disdain. "This is all circumstantial," he sneered, his gaze fixed on Jamal. "You have no concrete evidence tying me to any of this. Just a bunch of stories from people with axes to grind. If you're going to bring down an officer of my standing, you're going to need more than that." One of the committee members turned to Jamal, her expression thoughtful. "Sheriff Carter, while we respect your dedication, Officer Hensley is correct that without indisputable evidence, we cannot make any official ruling. Is there anything else you can provide?" Jamal's heart pounded as he felt the weight of the decision before him. This was his last chance, and he knew what he had to do. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out his phone and played the recording he had taken during his last confrontation with Bradley. The room was filled with Bradley's own voice, dripping with contempt as he had threatened Jamal, his words an open admission of his disdain for the very people he was supposed to protect. The effect was immediate. A murmur went through the room, and the members of the committee exchanged shocked glances. Bradley's face turned pale, his confidence faltering as he realized the depth of his miscalculation. Jamal watched as the committee's expressions hardened, their gazes shifting from him to Bradley with a newfound resolve. One of the senior officers leaned forward, his voice cold. "Officer Hensley, this behavior is not only unprofessional, it's a clear abuse of your authority. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation." Bradley shot to his feet, his face twisted in anger. "You can't do this. I have connections." You had connections," the committee member replied, cutting him off. "But those connections mean nothing in the face of undeniable evidence. You've disgraced this department, and you will answer for it." Bradley's protests fell on deaf ears as he was escorted out of the room, his once smug demeanor now replaced with a defeated rage. Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him as he watched Bradley's departure, knowing that the man who had caused so much pain would finally face justice. The hearing concluded, and as Jamal stepped out of the precinct, he was met with a crowd of his colleagues, some who had stood by him throughout the investigation, others who had been skeptical but were now looking at him with respect and admiration. Thompson approached him, a smile on his face. "You did it, Sheriff," he said, clapping Jamal on the shoulder. "You brought him down. Jamal nodded, a sense of quiet satisfaction filling him. We did it, Thompson. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who deserved justice. Darius was waiting outside, his face a mixture of relief and gratitude. He stepped forward, shaking Jamal's hand firmly. Thank you, Sheriff. You didn't just help me, you helped a lot of people who didn't think they'd ever see justice. Jamal's gaze softened. You were brave, Darius. You stood up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. That takes real courage. Darius smiled, a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he looked free, unburdened by the fear that had haunted him. And as Jamal looked around at the people gathered, he felt a deep sense of purpose, a reminder of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Back at home that evening, Jamal sat with Amara on their porch, the evening sky casting a warm glow over their quiet neighborhood. She leaned against him, her hand resting on her belly, a peaceful smile on her face. It's over, she said softly, her voice filled with relief. Jamal nodded, his gaze distant but content. It is. I just hope. I hope this is a step toward real change. A reminder that no one is above the law. Amara looked up at him, her eyes filled with pride. You made a difference, Jamal. You showed everyone that it's possible to stand up to people like Bradley, to fight for what's right. Jamal smiled, wrapping his arm around her. It was worth it. Every moment, every challenge. Knowing that people can walk around this city without fear, that's the greatest victory. The sound of a car pulling up caught their attention, and they turned to see Thompson stepping out, a small, respectful smile on his face. Evening, Sheriff. I just wanted to let you know. Bradley's resignation came through. He's finished. Jamal exhaled, a wave of satisfaction washing over him. Thank you, Thompson. For everything. Thompson nodded, tipping his hat slightly. You're a good man, Jamal. This city's lucky to have you. As Thompson drove away, Jamal felt a sense of closure settle over him. The fight was over, and he had come out on the other side stronger, more determined than ever to uphold the values he had sworn to protect. He knew that there would always be challenges, people like Bradley who sought to manipulate and control. But he also knew that he wasn't alone, that there were others willing to stand with him, to fight for what was right. As the story draws to a close, we're reminded of the powerful impact that one person's courage can have on an entire community. Jamal's journey was not just a fight against corruption, it was a testament to the strength of character, the unwavering commitment to justice, and the belief that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In life, we're often faced with difficult choices, moments that test our resolve and push us to our limits. Jamal's story reminds us that standing up for what's right is never easy, but it's always worth it. His courage not only brought justice to those who had suffered but also sent a powerful message to everyone watching, that integrity and perseverance can overcome even the darkest forces. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for what you believed in, even when it was difficult? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the importance of courage, of fighting for justice, and of never backing down in the face of adversity. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that inspire and challenge us to think. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you in the next story.